All right, guys, today we have a pretty simple lecture on case debating on both the affirmative and the negative. So, case obviously starts in the 1AC. The affirmative will stand up and present their scenarios, and the parts of a scenario is uniqueness, what is happening now. For example, in the domain awareness affirmative, that would be Russia and China are probing in the Arctic. Internal link, what would that lead to? For example, Russia and China probing in the Arctic would lead to miscalc, and the impact is miscalc causes extinction through nuclear warfare, accidental warfare, etc. Solvency, then the affirmative would say, is the affirmative would say is the plan solves by creating domain awareness technology which prevents miscalc. And all of these are important for the affirmative. And if they don't have any of that in any of their scenarios, or at least one of them, the negative team should definitely point that out. And the negative team usually needs to disprove one of these to have some mitigation to this offense that the 1AC presents. So pretty simple, but case debating truly starts in the 1 and C. This is also where most judges will start flowing, the 1 and C on case. So the goal of the 1 and C should be to refute every scenario. Obviously, it's not a big deal if you do maybe miss an impact or an internal link or a separate scenario in the 1 and C, because you would be able to bring that up again in the 2 and C. But a good 1 and C should be able to refute every scenario. And how you do that is through case negs you've prepped out before the tournament, or your impact defense file that you'll get access to when you get added to the Dropbox. So usually before the round, when the 1AC is sent out, I'm looking at the impacts of the 1AC because that is usually the most easiest to refute to. After all, if a new affirmative comes out, I'm not going to know arguments or have cards usually ready unless I have a case neg against their internal link or why the plan wouldn't solve or why their uniqueness or why the status quo isn't solving right now. The most I'll have is just impact defense, because every impact leads to something that's been read for, like Arctic war, global warming, etc. is stuff that I already have stuff prepped out, which is why most 1 and Cs you'll see usually only have impact defense. So while it is the easiest to get impact defense, it is oftentimes the most overrated. I'll get more into that later, but you should always aim to not just have impact defense. It's fine if you only have impact defense because that is the easiest thing to do and it's the best way to get coverage in the 1NC. But you also want to make sure you have smart internal link solvency uniqueness takeouts. And we'll get into why that's so uniquely key later. So a good 1NC case should usually have impact defense, analytical arguments 2 to 3, analytical arguments, especially against a new affirmative, innovation high or uniqueness. Before the tournament, it's a good idea to prep out, oh, biotech innovation is high right now, or miscalc is low right now, so that you already have responses prepped to the most common uniqueness claims that teams will bring up. For example, both the military logistics AF and the domain awareness AF had uniqueness about Russia and China going into the Arctic. So you might just want to already have before a tournament prepped out like why that's not true, and now you already have innovation uniqueness arguments. And obviously now, like since we're in the Trump era, a good argument to always be thinking about is Trump thumps. Like why hasn't this trade impact happened already? Because Trump probably collapsed trade, or this NATO impact, WTO impact, econ impact, whatever. A good 1 and C also spends a good amount of time on case, maybe 3 to 4 minutes, and usually, to maximize speeds and get judges to like you, you'll place the arguments near each other. So you'll have internal link takeouts near each other, uniqueness takeouts near each other, inherency arguments near each other. That will help you get your 1 and C case more organized, make it easier for the judge to flow, and have the debate more, I guess, cleaner. So the 2AC. So a couple of rules before we get into this is almost never read cards unless it's like offense, like impact turns, internal link turns. You never always want to read cards. Instead, you should be using your 1AC cards to respond to the 1NC cards. Or sometimes you could read it for important arguments you need to address. I know for our AF last year, latches, there was a big problem with inherency, so we read cards on inherency in the 2AC just to hammer down the strategy. And usually you want to be spending 2 minutes maximum on case in the 2AC. Anything else becomes too much, especially if they have like a lot of other off case positions. 2 minutes is usually all you need. Obviously, if the 1 and C is like overwhelming with case defense and they have like hedge bad or impact turns, you spend more. But if we're just talking about the defense they put on case, that should take around that. So the 2AC continued. How to respond, the first thing is signposting. Obviously, this really just comes with practice, but every 1 and C argument, you need to label it and then say the opposite of what's saying. So the 1 and C is going to stand up and say, I don't know, no warming impact. The 2AC should be 1 and C 1, yes, warming impact, directly refuting it and also signposting the judge what's going on. and what argument you're responding to. If no warming impact was their fourth argument on case, you would say 1 and C4, yes, warming impact. Or 1 and C4, the SQO can't solve. So it makes it a lot easier for the judges to flow, and judges will love you if you make sure your 2AC on case is very, very clean and clear. So the main way you want to respond to the 1NC case cards is using warrants from 1AC cards. The reason you have those cards in your 1AC is because they are the best cards that you could possibly get. And the more warrants that you have in the 2AC, that you're saying in the 2AC, our evidence says this, blah, 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 and that directly refutes their evidence, it's easier for the 1ER because the 2NC is probably dropping some of that. And you also spend less time in prep. So when I was a 2A, and what I heard from others is that what I would do is when I was looking at my 1AC, I would take notes on every single 1AC card, every single warrant, why I picked that card, why it's so good, why it's better than other alternatives. So like going into the tournament, I look at a 1 and C card, a defense to my biotech, my warming impact, and I'm already like, yeah, my card has warrants that I need to respond to, or my card has warrants that already respond to the 1 and C card, and I already know why my 1AC card is so great. So I have the confidence knowing that this 1 and C card is probably not as great as my 1AC card. And it ends up spending less time in 2AC prep, which is really important because as sophomores and underclassmen, the biggest thing that you guys need to work on is getting your 2AC prep done very quickly. And the best way to do that is spending less time on case by knowing what your 1AC cards are saying on the top of your head and why that would respond to each 1 and C impact. Oh, and one more thing, if the 1 and C drops an entire scenario, an entire impact, make sure you extend that impact. I know, like, you want to bring it up in the 2AR. Oh, during this entire debate, they've dropped it. But you need to extend your scenarios. If they dropped, for example, a warming scenario, like you saying, oh, something's going to happen that's causing warming, the plan would solve for that, and the 1 and C just doesn't touch it, you need to bring that up. Say, dropped a warming impact, blah, blah, blah. So now the 2 and C 1 and R, usually the 2 and C is the one with the case defense. Are some exceptions when the 1 and R gets case. Usually that's just decided with you and your partner. But maybe when there's a new affirmative and you want to think about case a lot more, give yourself more time to think about case. Go heavy on case. Then the 1 and R sometimes takes 5 minutes of case, but that's very, very rare. Sometimes a block doesn't need case at all. These are situations where, the negative team's offense doesn't need the case to win. For example, if your negative block strategy is a counter plan and T in the 2 and C, and then the 1 and R you have a K that doesn't let you weigh the 1AC, then you don't need case because how would case help you win the debate? Or maybe you have two counter plans and a topicality shell in the block. Once again, you don't need case because the counter plans are solving for case, and your T is basically saying the card should have never been read in the first place. So usually you spend in the 2 and C, if you're going for a normal position, a counterplan case and then decide in the 1 and R, you should be spending around 3 to 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on your strategy, depending on how much you want to go for. But yeah, that's usually how much you want to spend on the 2 and C. Sometimes if you want to go like all in on case and you want to like make this a disad case debate, you want to mitigate case as much as possible. Sometimes, I take 5 minutes a case in the 2 and C. And that's just depending on what you want to go for. But one of the most important things that you need to make sure is that no impact is dropped. It makes the life for the 2 and R way harder, especially going for a disad, right? Because if you're going for a politics disad, if they have some defense to that disad, and you've completely just dropped an impact in the 1AC, if you just completely dropped an impact in the 1AC, then like they will just say any risk of defense on the disad means that you vote affirmative because we have 100% risk, and even if they have 99% risk, that means you vote for us. The structure of a 2 and C should be an analytical extension of the 1 and C argument and evidence. So as back from in the 2 and C, the 2AC starts labeling stuff. It says 1 and C 1, yes, warming impact. You want to keep consistent with that numbering. So if you're extending your no warming impact, you want to say 1 and C 1, no warming impact, and extend the 1 and C argument, the 1 and C evidence. Make sure you're saying the warrants of your 1 and C evidence. Then you want to respond to the 2AC, the most important part, just making sure you're not just reading cards, and then read more evidence. But make sure that when you're reading more evidence, you're not just repeating your 1 and C evidence. For example, in the 1 and C, if I read a card saying no Arctic war because Ukraine is draining all of Russia's supplies, that means they can't attack in the Arctic. I don't want to read more cards in the 2 and C saying the exact same thing about how Ukraine has now tranquilized the Arctic. That just doesn't make sense. Now the 1AR, this is a speech all about efficiency and covering everything. So the 1AR should only spend about 45 seconds to 1 minute max on case, and you should only go for like one or two scenarios. You still want to be responsive and make sure on the other disadvantages or whatever, like off case positions, you have responses to turns case. Otherwise, it's easy for the negative to just stand up and be like, we can access and solve or do whatever on the affirmative team's offense, but they don't access ours. And it becomes a lot easier for the judge to vote neg. So picking the scenarios you want to go for, because you're only going to go for one or two, sometimes three if you really think the negative team messed up on a bunch of them and you feel like you want like big amounts of offense, you have enough time for that. You want to think about these questions like which ones does the block drop or have really bad responses to? Which ones access their offense on the disad, the K, etc. So if I have a scenario that specifically solves for the impact on the disadvantage, I'd probably want to respond to that. Or I'd probably want to extend that because it makes it a lot easier for me to say, hey, our impact solves for this. Or like a scenario that turns the impact on the disadvantage. So once again, you access their offense. And then also which ones have the largest scope, fastest time frame, etc. So in our current path of the pipelines affirmative, a lot of teams know that AGI is our biggest impact, and they'll have cards on no AGI, and this is like the one scenario they almost never drop. But like we still go for it every time because the impacts we get from it are so big. There's like a bunch of them. It ends up solving for a lot of the other impacts that are read on the off case positions, which makes it a lot better for us to read. Okay, the 2NR, 2AR. This should be using case as a responsive comparative to other off case positions. So, unlike the past speeches where you're just like extend 1 and CX, no warming impact, now you're really contextualizing it to the rest of the debate. The 2NR choice that you made, you want to go for this disadvantage. Explain why your case defense means you are also voting on the disadvantage, right? So you can also use case as a factor of your tweener choice, even if you think that, hey, they actually did a pretty good job in responding to this disadvantage, and your other option is a counterplan. But they're like, okay, but they dropped a bunch of arguments on case. You know that like case is probably going to be pretty low. The risk of case is going to be low at the end of debate. So even if they spent a good amount of time on the disad, you can still go for the disad because you know that case was very low, and you could use that as a factor in your 2NR choice. So overall, the 2AR and the 2NR need to have a lot of storytelling and comparative calculus on why your impacts matter more than whatever the other team is extending, right? Rather than just like every other speech, just independently responding to every single warrant. You want to kind of make sure it's embedded in the rest of the debate here. And you obviously want to spend more time, right? The 2NR should spend, 1, maybe even 2 minutes on case, and the 2AR should spend about equal amount of time, maybe even more if they want to. So here's some just as before we finish, just some key terms that you want to make sure you know. Try or die. It's very important to mitigate this. It's essentially where the negative team or affirmative team, it literally is like it is try or die to solve for my impacts. So maybe for a critique that negative team goes for, if critique the negative team goes for, if all the affirmative team brings up is, hey, the alternative is worse, then the negative team can say, okay, yeah, but it's we need to try to do this, otherwise we die. Same thing with the affirmative. If all the negative team extends is no solvency, the plan cannot solve because of these limitations, the affirmative team can stand up and say it is try or die, because even if there's a chance we cannot solve, you know that our impacts, internal links, this is happening in the SCO now, and we need to mitigate it immediately. So it is literally try or we will die. And a lot of judges like that framing, and they end up, feeling it's kind of a magnifier for your offense. So you want to make sure that you're not in a situation where it is try or die for the other team. A lot of like teams will just say it's try or die when it's not. But that's why like a lot of the times you don't want to make sure you're only extending, solvency defense, even though it's great, right? You want to pair it with some internal link defense. Second is presumption. It's another argument where the judge is literally certain the affirmative does nothing. So if like the affirmative drops 7 to 8 arguments on case, literally like there's no chance they can solve for their impacts, then the judge can vote on presumption. Even if the affirmative is winning on, let's say, the disad, like the disad is also very near zero, or the counterplan. The counterplan does not solve the counterplan does not solve the affirmative. It does not. It loses to the perm. If the judge is like certain the AF does nothing, they can vote on presumption. So a way to think about presumption is like innocent until proven guilty. The defendant is the SQO, and the negative is defending the SQO. If the affirmative fails to prove that the status quo needs change, the negative team votes on presumption, presuming that the status quo does not need change. So yeah. And one thing I'd like to go over, I said I would go over it, is 1C. So impact defense is also pretty overrated because a lot of the times a 1AC will be spammed with impacts, right? They'll have like 5 to 7 impacts in every advantage. Arctic war, global warming, etc. So having internal link solvency uniqueness is really good for the 2NC specifically because if the 1AR comes up and says, "Hey, you dropped this impact that we actually hid in the 2AC," the negative team will have internal link evidence or solvency evidence that still responds to the impact because it's contesting whether that impact would happen in the first place or whether the affirmative team would solve for that. So making sure your 2NCs are not just impact defense is a really good idea, and it's also a great way to boost your speaks. If it is impact defense though, don't stress. That's fine. Other than that, you can message us if you have any questions. But that is basically case debating in a nutshell. Thank you.